In the remote fog-shrouded waters of the North Pacific, there lies a little-known footnote of World War II. A moment when Allied commanders prepared for one of the most anticipated assaults of the Aleutian campaign, unaware that the greatest danger they faced would not come from the enemy. In early August 1943, as the chill winds swept over Adak and Amchitka Islands, the men of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division and the Canadian 6th Infantry Brigade braced for the invasion of Kiska. To them, Kiska was not just another island. It was the last Japanese stronghold in the Aleutians, and the memory of the brutal battle for Attu months earlier weighed heavily on their minds. The struggle began long before the first landing craft reached Kiska's black volcanic shore. For over a year, Japanese forces had occupied the island, serving as a strategic outpost for the Northern Pacific. American codebreakers estimated nearly 5,400 Japanese troops remained entrenched on Kiska, veterans of the harsh Aleutian climate who had dug extensive tunnels and reinforced gun emplacements. The terrain itself was the enemy: jagged mountains, sodden tundra, and a fog so thick it swallowed entire patrols. Soldiers of the 7th Division, many of whom had trained in the deserts of California, now prepared for a fight in what some commanders called the worst place on Earth. Tension built as preparations intensified. Daily briefings repeated the same warnings: expect fortified bunkers, ambush positions, and concealed Japanese artillery. Patrol leaders reviewed maps marked with suspected minefields and cave networks. Naval officers rehearsed bombardments, timing salvos from battleships such as USS Pennsylvania and cruisers like USS Portland. Every man knew that the Japanese defenders had held Attu with fanatical resistance, costing the Allies nearly 4,000 casualties. "Don't underestimate them," one officer wrote in his diary. "Kiska will be worse." Yet even with this foreboding, something about the island remained uncertain. Aerial reconnaissance offered only partial glimpses through the chronic fog that clung to the slopes. Photographs showed defensive positions but rarely movement. Allied commanders attributed the silence to discipline. Japanese soldiers were known for camouflage and concealment. Still, a handful of intelligence officers quietly wondered why radio transmissions from Kiska had fluctuated in recent weeks. No one could confirm whether it signaled weakness, deception, or something else entirely. As the invasion date drew near, the logistical challenge became immense. Thousands of American and Canadian troops assembled on transport vessels. Infantrymen from the 17th, 32nd, and 184th Regiments, supported by specialized scouts, engineers, and artillery units. Long lines of landing craft were prepared to push through the surf under the cover of naval gunfire. Overhead, P-38 Lightnings, B-24 Liberators, and Canadian Ventura patrol bombers scouted the seas, searching for any Japanese reinforcement fleet that might surge northward. The Aleutian weather spared no one. Wet boots, chilled hands, and low visibility became daily obstacles. Inside the cramped holds of the transports, soldiers cleaned their rifles and checked their gear repeatedly. Many remembered the disastrous bonsai charges on Attu and feared they would face the same on Kiska. A soldier from the 32nd Infantry later wrote, "We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. Everyone knew what Attu had cost us." Rumors spread that Japanese snipers had dug in on the ridges overlooking Gertrude Cove. Others believed the Japanese had mined the entire beach. No one expected an easy landing. The mystery deepened on August 14th, just one day before the scheduled assault, when a reconnaissance pilot reported seeing no signs of enemy patrols along the shoreline. Command dismissed the observation. Fog often concealed troop movements. But among the men preparing to land, the report circulated as a whisper. What if the Japanese are waiting for us? What if they want us to come ashore first? By dawn on August 15th, the invasion force approached Kiska under a blanket of fog so thick visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. The naval bombardment thundered across the island, shaking the decks of the ships as shells crashed into suspected strongpoints. The men listened to the blasts, imagining the devastation, and the enemy waiting just beyond the smoke. When the order finally came, landing craft surged forward, engines churning against the icy surf. Heartbeats quickened. Rifles clutched tighter. The shoreline loomed like a dark apparition through the fog. But something was wrong. No gunfire returned. No artillery flashed from the cliffs. The beach remained eerily silent. And as boots hit the volcanic sand, the soldiers realized that the invasion of Kiska, anticipated for months, feared for weeks, was not unfolding as expected. The enemy, it seemed, was nowhere to be found. What happened here? How could thousands of Japanese troops simply vanish from an island under constant Allied observation? Those answers would only begin to surface in the hours ahead. For the men stepping ashore on Kiska on August 15, 1943, the silence was more unsettling than any explosion. Fog rolled in heavy sheets across the coastline, swallowing shapes and muffling sound until even the crash of the breakers seemed distant. This was the Aleutians, where weather was as dangerous as bullets, but the absence of gunfire on a battlefield expected to be fiercely defended defied every instinct the soldiers had. The U.S. 7th Infantry Division and the Canadian 6th Infantry Brigade advanced cautiously, rifles raised, waiting for the first shot that never came. The struggle began immediately, not with combat, but with uncertainty. For weeks, Allied planners had drilled the invasion force for a brutal landing. They had studied Japanese tactics from Attu, hidden machine gun nests, snipers positioned in rocky crags, and infantry concealed within tunnel networks carved deep into the volcanic earth. As the first platoons crossed the black sands of Kiska Harbor, they braced for an ambush. Every shadow in the fog looked like a gun position. Every rock formation could have concealed a sniper. No one relaxed, because no one believed the Japanese had simply abandoned such a strategic foothold. The landing force split into its designated assault paths. The U.S. 17th Infantry advanced toward the radar station and communication outposts to the east, while the 32nd Infantry pushed inland toward the thick, waterlogged tundra separating the beaches from the high interior ridges. The Canadian 13th Infantry Brigade anchored the northern approach, moving cautiously up the slopes of Trout Lagoon. Maps warned of pillboxes, anti-aircraft batteries, and strongpoints built into the hills. Naval intelligence had predicted stiff resistance. Instead, the soldiers found only fog. Still, the tension never eased. "You kept expecting a shot to ring out," recalled one American sergeant. Even the quiet felt hostile. The fog restricted visibility to only a few yards. Patrols disappeared into it like ghosts, and commanders had to rely on compasses to stay aligned with their assigned routes. In some cases, entire companies marched in silence for minutes at a time, unable to see the men ahead of them. An entry from a Canadian officer's field notebook captured the mood succinctly. "Quiet everywhere. Too quiet. Men are uneasy. Can't see 10 feet. Smells like a trap." Commanders echoed this fear. The Japanese were known for discipline and deception. If they were silent, it could mean they were regrouping deeper in the island, waiting to lure Allied forces into narrow valleys where machine guns and mortars could be concentrated. But the first real clue that something was different came just below a ridge overlooking the main harbor. Scouts from the U.S. 184th Infantry found a Japanese shelter with blankets still rolled out, a cooking pot still warm, and food partially prepared. The scene was haunting, abandoned abruptly, yet not in panic. The Japanese evacuation, if it had occurred, had been deliberate and orderly. But how? Allied submarines and reconnaissance aircraft had observed the island for weeks. No major evacuation fleet had been detected. No radio traffic hinted at a mass withdrawal. The fog thickened throughout the morning, complicating every movement. Soldiers tripped over hidden barbed wire. Others stumbled into abandoned Japanese trenches, unsure whether they were alone. The ground was slick, the air wet and heavy. Equipment rusted quickly in the Aleutian climate, and boots sank deep into the tundra. The landscape was hostile enough to kill, even without an enemy firing back. Yet as more units progressed, they discovered a series of empty defensive positions, machine gun nests without gunners, artillery emplacements without crews, and communication lines cut cleanly as if by deliberate hands. It was becoming clear that Kiska was not defended. Still, no one dared to believe it fully. The memory of Attu, where Japanese troops used silence as bait before launching devastating attacks, lingered in every soldier's mind. By midday, confusion dominated the battlefield. The U.S. 32nd Infantry accidentally opened fire on a movement they spotted in the fog, only to realize moments later that they had engaged friendly forces. This first incident did little more than graze nerves, but it foreshadowed a greater danger. The fog itself was becoming the deadliest adversary on Kiska. In the absence of Japanese resistance, commanders grew increasingly perplexed. If the Japanese had withdrawn, they had done so with flawless precision. No stragglers, no damaged equipment, no bodies left behind. It contradicted everything common about a wartime retreat. Moreover, the Allied blockade should have made an evacuation impossible. Destroyers and submarines patrolled the surrounding waters. Air reconnaissance flew daily missions. Nothing had been detected. But as the sun struggled to break through the fog, never fully succeeding, one unsettling question began to echo through the ranks. If the Japanese had left, when did they do it? And how had we missed it? By the time the first night fell, soldiers dug in, still expecting a shock attack. No one knew yet that the true dangers of Kiska were just beginning, and the enemy, though gone, had left behind more than empty trenches. At first light on August 16, 1943, the mystery of Kiska deepened. Patrols advancing inland discovered evidence of a swift, deliberate evacuation. Clue after clue that Japanese forces had not fled in chaos, but had vanished with precision. The fog still clung to the island like a suffocating blanket, but as American and Canadian troops pushed through the abandoned positions, they stumbled upon signs of life extinguished only hours or days before. A kettle left beside a still warm stove. Blankets folded with military neatness. Even a half-eaten meal resting untouched on a wooden crate. These details, mundane in appearance, became anchor points of an unsettling truth. The enemy had been here recently, yet not a single soldier remained. The struggle now shifted from fear of enemy fire to the psychological strain of an invisible foe. The 32nd Infantry Regiment, advancing through a shallow valley toward the Japanese tent city, moved cautiously, each man expecting the next step to bring them into a firefight. Instead, they encountered hastily abandoned supply dumps filled with rice bags, ammunition crates, and medical kits. The absence of bodies was remarkable. Japanese military doctrine stressed death before capture. Normally, Allied troops found defenders who fought to the last man. Here, there was nothing. The silence became a pressure point, twisting nerves as soldiers tried to understand whether they were walking into an empty island or an elaborate ambush. Historical insights soon emerged from the perimeter sweep. Engineers and scouts from the Canadian 24th Brigade uncovered sophisticated tunnel entrances carved into the volcanic rock, their interiors lined with timber supports. Inside, the tunnels showed signs of hurried use. Footprints pressed into damp soil, recently extinguished lanterns, and tools left scattered on the ground. A sergeant noted in his report, "They left as if they expected to return." The tunnels, some stretching hundreds of feet, had once housed artillery crews and sheltered troops from the relentless Aleutian bombardments. Now they were vacant, save for scattered Japanese documents that hinted at signals traffic but contained no evacuation orders. The reveal came when U.S. intelligence officers pieced together clues from Japanese diaries retrieved on the island. One entry, likely belonging to a petty officer, read, "Fog is our ally. Departure imminent. Silence is victory." Though the date was smudged, analysts believed it referenced early July. The Japanese had evacuated Kiska weeks before Operation Cottage, even while Allied aircraft conducted daily raids and naval ships shelled the coastline. Somehow, more than 5,000 troops slipped past the blockade undetected. The enemy's disappearance, far from accidental, was a masterstroke of timing and deception. Yet the absence of defenders did not mean safety. As the Allies advanced deeper inland, they encountered booby traps strung across paths, mines tucked into vegetation, and tripwires hidden beneath moss-covered rocks. One Canadian patrol discovered a 75mm artillery shell rigged beneath a cooking pan, an improvised device designed to maim the first soldier to investigate abandoned equipment. Engineers spent hours clearing mines that, according to estimates, had been placed within days of evacuation. The Japanese had not only withdrawn but had prepared Kiska to remain lethal long after their departure. The modern lesson, even decades later, resonates clearly. A battlefield without visible enemies is sometimes the most dangerous of all. Allied forces had prepared for a frontal assault, yet now faced unpredictable hazards with no adversary to engage. It was a rare inversion of tactics, fighting not men, but the remnants of their planning. As the day wore on, units from the 17th Infantry linked with Canadian patrols on the island's southern side. Merging their findings, commanders recognized the scale of the evacuation. The Japanese had removed artillery, communications gear, and even many personal belongings. Only items too heavy or too risky to transport were left behind. U.S. Navy analysts theorized the operation must have involved multiple destroyers operating under thick fog, using radio silence and precise timing to avoid detection. The Aleutian climate had always hindered Allied surveillance. Now it appeared to have shielded the enemy's escape perfectly. Still, unanswered questions gnawed at officers. How had the Japanese coordinated such a rapid withdrawal across treacherous seas? Why had Allied intelligence failed to detect any signs of movement? And most importantly, had the evacuation been complete, or had small Japanese detachments remained behind to harass the incoming forces? Every abandoned trench was searched thoroughly. Every rusted steel helmet, every scattered ration tin was studied for clues. The closing hours of August 16th were marked by a growing realization. The enemy was gone, but the mystery of their disappearance was not. As night fell and the fog thickened once more, radio operators transmitted a cautious update to the fleet offshore: no confirmed enemy contacts. Yet even with this message, soldiers dug in for the night, unsure whether shadows in the fog concealed stragglers or simply played tricks on exhausted minds. And as the wind swept across the darkened ridges, one unsettling thought echoed through the ranks. If the Japanese had truly vanished, what deadly surprises might still lie ahead on this abandoned island? Night on Kiska Island brought with it a kind of darkness soldiers rarely experienced. Fog so dense it absorbed lantern light, silence so complete it smothered even the sound of the surf. By August 17th, the second full day of Operation Cottage, Allied troops had advanced across miles of rugged terrain without a single confirmed Japanese sighting. Yet tension refused to fade. The terrain itself seemed hostile, and soldiers grew increasingly suspicious of the emptiness. Then, without warning, the island turned violent, though not from the enemy they had come to fight. The hook came shortly after dawn, when forward elements of the U.S. 32nd Infantry reported movement in the fog along a ridgeline. Outlines, vague, shifting, advanced silently through the mist. The Americans raised their rifles, convinced they were moments from making contact with the long-anticipated Japanese defenders. When a shot cracked the air, chaos erupted. Automatic weapons answered from the opposite slope. Grenades detonated in the valley between the two forces. Only after nearly 10 minutes of firefight did someone shout the chilling realization: Americans were firing on Americans. The movement in the fog had been another U.S. patrol attempting to flank the ridge. In the struggle that followed throughout the day, friendly fire emerged as the deadliest threat on Kiska. Units isolated by the terrain and blinded by fog mistook each other repeatedly for Japanese troops. The Canadians suffered the first major incident when a patrol from the 13th Infantry Brigade stumbled into an American position near the island's central saddle. Both sides opened fire instinctively. The fog turned every silhouette into an enemy, a Canadian lieutenant recalled. By the time we realized what we were doing, it was too late. 5 men were killed, several more wounded, without a single Japanese shot fired. The insight from Commander's field notes reveals how fully the terrain dictated events. Reports from the 7th Infantry Division headquarters describe visibility as low as 3 to 5 yards at times, less than the length of a jeep. Compass bearings became unreliable in the magnetic rock formations. Radios failed intermittently due to damp air and mountainous barriers. Kiska was a battlefield that stripped away all advantages, wrote one officer. We had no horizon, no clear lines. We were fighting ghosts, often our own. Yet even as friendly fire incidents mounted, new revelations about the island's defenses emerged. Engineers sweeping the high ridges discovered rows of interconnected trenches branching off into narrower spider holes. Many were wired with explosive charges. The Japanese had buried dozens of mines in seemingly random patterns, ensuring that anyone advancing through the island would walk through a lethal maze. Some mines were cleverly hidden under moss and mud. Others were suspended in trees as improvised aerial traps. Though the garrison had vanished, its defenses remained alive and unpredictable. Late in the afternoon, a U.S. Navy shore party discovered something even more unsettling: a series of abandoned Japanese radio positions, each with transmitters intact. Logs suggested the last messages were sent in early July. But some entries appeared deliberately vague, as if intended to mislead anyone intercepting them. Intelligence teams speculated that the Japanese had used false signal traffic to keep Allied forces convinced Kiska was fully manned. The fog, radio silence, and clever decoys all played into a larger pattern of deception. The reveal that shook many commanders came when Canadian scouts located a dummy anti-aircraft battery constructed from logs, scrap metal, and canvas. From above, the illusion had appeared convincing, just one of many factors leading the Allies to believe the garrison was still active. Similar decoys were found across the island: fake tents, false ammunition stacks, and wooden silhouettes shaped like soldiers. Kiska had become a stage where defenders had vanished, but their props still lingered. A modern reflection on these discoveries underscores an enduring military truth: uncertainty is often more dangerous than an opposing force. On Kiska, the fog and deception created an environment where judgment failed, nerves frayed, and allies became unwitting adversaries. The lack of gunfire did not calm the troops, it amplified every doubt. Soldiers grew reluctant to move without verification, slowing the advance and increasing exposure to mines and booby traps. As evening approached on August 17th, the island erupted once more in accidental combat. A Canadian patrol signaled movement on a hillside. Moments later, the crack of rifles echoed across the valley. American forces returned fire. Another firefight between allies broke out before officers managed to cut through the chaos and regroup the units. Casualties mounted. By nightfall, the realization spread that the fog, not the Japanese, had become the true defender of Kiska. The close of the day found commanders gathered in makeshift field headquarters, analyzing maps, casualty lists, and fragments of intelligence. The picture forming before them was unlike anything in the Pacific War: an invasion where thousands of men had landed prepared for fierce combat, only to fight shadows and traps left behind by an enemy who had already escaped. But lingering questions pressed heavily. How complete was this evacuation? Could small Japanese squads still be hiding in tunnels deep within the mountains? And if the enemy had truly withdrawn, what had been their strategic purpose in leaving so abruptly? As night draped itself once again across the volcanic ridges, soldiers dug in, listening for any sign that the enemy might yet reveal itself. But the only sound was the wind sliding across the desolate slopes, an eerie whisper reminding them that the island still held secrets they had yet to uncover. By August 18, 1943, the truth behind Kiska's eerie silence finally began to take shape. The Allied search teams, Americans and Canadians trudging through sodden valleys and over jagged ridges, had mapped nearly every major Japanese position. Each discovery reinforced the same startling conclusion: the enemy had vanished without leaving behind a single soldier, alive or dead. It was a military impossibility, or at least, it should have been. More than 5,000 Japanese troops had once occupied this island. Now, not one could be found. The question that consumed every commander was simple and confounding: how had a garrison of that size escaped a blockade designed to trap them? The struggle to unravel this mystery began with the work of intelligence officers who, sifting through abandoned documents and equipment, pieced together fragments of a story. Logs from Japanese engineering teams revealed that preparations for an evacuation had begun months earlier. Some entries described quiet movements across the island at night, the dismantling of heavier equipment, and strict orders for radio silence. Yet none gave a definitive date or explained how the garrison intended to slip past the Allied fleet. The fog, constant and blinding, had become their ally, covering not only the island but also, it seemed, their departure. Declassified Japanese records later revealed the full scope of Operation Kugo, the evacuation plan. But on Kiska in 1943, American and Canadian commanders could only guess. The prevailing theory took shape when Navy personnel searching the southern shoreline discovered fresh indentations, long, smooth grooves cut into the black sand. They were too uniform to be natural. Sailors recognized the pattern immediately. These were the scars left by destroyer keels and landing barges. Whatever had happened, the Japanese fleet had come very close to shore, likely under the cover of a fog so dense that even Allied radar had failed to detect them. An officer from the U.S. Navy Patrol Wing 4 recalled in his after-action notes, "We had flown sorties daily, but the clouds were endless. You might pass 50 yards above a destroyer and never know it." The Aleutian weather, often cursed by Allied pilots, had provided perfect concealment for the enemy. The Japanese had exploited this environmental advantage masterfully. The reveal emerged as engineers found more evidence in the form of severed communication cables, not cut randomly, but systematically, almost ceremonially. The Japanese had removed radio equipment, heavy artillery pieces, and most personal effects. They left behind only what they could not move quickly or quietly. On one ridge, a Canadian search team found a line of wooden poles planted in the earth, each stripped bare except for a single piece of cloth fluttering weakly in the wind. It was as if the defenders had erased their own presence, leaving only scars in the landscape. But while the Japanese evacuation had been bloodless, Operation Cottage was anything but. Reports began to circulate among the troops. Casualties were rising, but not from combat. Friendly fire continued to plague units still navigating the treacherous fog. The tally grew with each accidental exchange. Mines and booby traps added to the toll. One of the deadliest incidents occurred when an American patrol triggered a hidden Japanese landmine while approaching the entrance of a tunnel system. Explosions thundered through the hillside, collapsing portions of the tunnel and injuring men in adjacent sections. The casualties from this incident alone reached double digits. Allied medical officers, prepared for bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries, found themselves treating broken limbs from falls down unseen ravines, twisted ankles from stepping into hidden foxholes, and shock from near misses involving fellow soldiers. Kiska had become a battlefield without enemies, yet still filled with lethal hazards. The irony was not lost on anyone. One Canadian corporal remarked bitterly, "We invaded a ghost island, and the ghosts are killing us." From a modern perspective, the evacuation remains one of the most impressive withdrawal operations of the war. Japanese destroyers braved Allied patrol zones, slipping into Kiska under a shroud of fog, loading thousands of troops, and departing without detection. It was a feat of seamanship and timing that military historians still study today. The Aleutian climate, normally a curse, had become their shield. The evacuation also served a strategic purpose: to preserve manpower after the loss of Attu, recognizing that defending Kiska had become untenable. But in 1943, the Allies saw it differently. To them, this was a baffling intelligence failure. Aircraft had flown reconnaissance missions daily. Navy ships had patrolled constantly. And yet, a full division-sized force had slipped through unnoticed. The sense of embarrassment was palpable among senior commanders. They had launched a massive invasion, 34,000 troops, for an enemy who no longer existed on the island. As the day closed on August 18th, commanders assembled casualty reports. More than 300 Allied troops had been killed or wounded, not by Japanese resistance, but by the island itself and the fog-induced confusion of friendly fire. The final tally was sobering, even tragic. Still, one more question lingered. Had every Japanese soldier escaped? The tunnels ran deep, some branching into caverns the size of small warehouses. Could stragglers still be hiding, waiting for nightfall to strike one last time? Or had the entire garrison truly vanished into the mist? As night settled again over the silent ridges, the men of the 7th Division kept their rifles close. Even with the growing evidence of evacuation, no one dared assume the island was safe. Kiska still felt alive, haunted not by enemies, but by the possibility of what they might have left behind. By August 19, 1943, Kiska Island was secured, at least on paper. American and Canadian units now controlled every major ridge, cove, and valley. But despite the growing certainty that the Japanese were gone, there remained one final unsettling truth. No one could yet explain how thousands of troops had vanished through a naval blockade regarded as nearly impenetrable. The Aleutian fog had hidden much, but the scale of the disappearance demanded answers. Operation Cottage was intended to be the climactic assault of the Aleutian campaign. Instead, it became a forensic investigation into one of the most quietly astonishing maneuvers of the Pacific War. The hook of this final chapter begins with a small detail discovered by U.S. Navy divers exploring Kiska's coastline. Anchored deep within the volcanic sand, they found a rusted cable, cut clean, not broken. Nearby, stakes driven into the seabed suggested temporary mooring points. These remnants hinted that a precise naval operation had occurred in the exact waters the Allies believed they controlled. As the divers surfaced, their discovery cemented a growing realization. Japanese destroyers had docked here under the nose of the Allied fleet. The struggle for answers intensified as intelligence officers pulled together all available evidence. Reconnaissance logs, ship movements, radar sweeps, and meteorological data were re-examined. The picture that emerged was one of opportunity born from chaos. During the first week of July, a massive weather front swept across the Aleutians. Clouds smothered the islands, and visibility dropped to near zero. Allied aircraft were grounded for days. Naval patrols remained on station but were effectively blind in the fog. In those same days, the Japanese Northern Fleet, led by the destroyer Abyakuma and nearly a dozen escorts, crept toward Kiska. Insights came from post-war Japanese accounts, including the testimony of Captain Shigenori Kami, who helped coordinate the evacuation. He described navigating through a sea of white nothing, relying on dead reckoning and sheer nerve. The destroyers approached so close to the shoreline that sailors said they could hear waves breaking against the rocks. In less than an hour, they loaded thousands of troops. The fog was so dense, one officer recalled, that the crews could not see the bow of their own ship. Yet the operation proceeded without incident. Allied forces, mere miles away, observed nothing. For the Allies in 1943, however, such details remained unknown. What they did see were the consequences: an island fortified to repel an invasion, yet completely empty. The reveal came through painstaking investigation of the Japanese camps. Analysts found evidence that the withdrawal had been conducted in total radio silence. Dummy broadcasts had been transmitted from automated systems, timed to mimic typical communication intervals. Decoy installations, fake radar sets, false bunkers, even wooden silhouettes, had misled aerial reconnaissance. The island had been turned into a stage set, a facsimile of an active garrison. A modern reflection on the incident underscores one of the central lessons of warfare. Deception can be as powerful as firepower. The Japanese evacuation of Kiska was not simply an escape, it was a strategic illusion. By maintaining the appearance of occupation, Japan forced the Allies to commit massive resources, then walk blindly into an empty battlefield filled with booby traps, mines, and the looming danger of friendly fire. It remains one of the most effective large-scale evacuations ever executed in the Pacific theater. But for the men on the ground in 1943, the intellectual clarity of hindsight was far away. What they experienced was confusion, tension, and the lingering fear that even a single hidden defender could emerge from the tunnels and wreak havoc. Many units spent days sweeping every cave and shelter, often crawling through darkness lit only by flashlights. Engineers detonated explosives to collapse tunnel systems large enough to hide dozens of troops. Each detonation echoed through the hills like thunder, reminding the soldiers that they still inhabited a battlefield, even if its soldiers had vanished. Gradually, Kiska revealed its final secrets. Patrols found no stragglers, no wounded, no bodies. The Japanese had left completely, an entire garrison extracted without a trace. The casualty reports finalized in late August told a sobering story. More than 300 Allied dead and wounded in an operation where not a single hostile shot was fired. The tragedy was compounded by the realization that these losses had been avoidable, a harsh combination of weather, terrain, mines, and the fog of war in its most literal form. As the Aleutian Campaign concluded, historians, commanders, and intelligence officers all debated what Operation Cottage meant. Some saw it as a reminder of the unpredictability of war. Others viewed it as a painful intelligence failure. But nearly all agreed that Kiska had become a symbol of how war can deceive even the most prepared armies. The closing image of this story is not of a firefight or a triumphant assault, but of soldiers standing on an empty ridge at dusk, looking over a landscape scarred by trenches and unexploded shells. The wind carried only silence. In that moment, the men of the U.S. 7th Division and the Canadian 6th Infantry Brigade understood that they had conquered an island and a mystery. The enemy had disappeared into the fog, leaving behind only questions, cautionary lessons, and a battlefield unlike any other of World War II. Operation Cottage would be remembered not for the fight the Allies expected, but for the eerie truth they found instead. Sometimes the most haunting battles are the ones where the enemy is already gone.